All right, welcome to our deep dive today. We are going to be cracking open The Liberal Mind by Lyle Rossiter. And, right off the bat, I want to say this isn't about, left versus right. This is
Yeah,
about understanding the psychology behind how we form our political beliefs. And I think
mm,
that's something that
totally.
anyone can get on board with. And it's a really fascinating look at how our childhood experiences can actually shape our views on liberty, personal responsibility,
Yeah.
the role of government.
Yeah. And Roster, as a psychiatrist, he approaches this
Yeah.
from a really unique angle.
Yeah.
And he argues that, those early years, especially within the family unit,
Yeah.
have a huge influence on how we see the world politically as adults.
So it's not just about the issues themselves,
Right.
but about the deeper psychological factors that might be driving our beliefs. That's a pretty intriguing idea.
It is.
One of the first things that jumped out at me was Rossiter's concept of the bipolar nature of man.
Okay.
It sounds kind of complex. Can you break that down for us a little bit?
Yeah, it is complex, but it's also really insightful. He's basically saying that humans are wired with these two core drives
Hmm.
that are seemingly at odds. We have this deep-seated desire for autonomy,
Yeah.
that need to be self-governing, make our own choices.
Hmm.
But at the same time, we have this need for mutuality,
Mhm.
a longing to connect with others, to cooperate
Mhm.
and respect each other's rights.
So it's like this internal tug of war between me and we.
Yeah, exactly.
I can see how that plays out in so many aspects of life, not just politics.
Right.
But how does Rossiter connect this back to childhood development?
He argues that how these drives are nurtured or even neglected during our childhood
Yeah.
can profoundly shape our adult political leanings. So let's take the example of adult competence. Rossiter says to be truly competent as an adult means becoming self-reliant, responsible, and able to function effectively in a free market.
So someone who struggles with those things as an adult might have had childhood experiences that hindered
Potentially.
that development. Like, what kind of experiences are we talking about here?
So think about a child learning to ride a bike. They might want their parent to hold on forever, but eventually they need to take the risk of pedaling on their own, even if it means falling a few times. Those falls, and the eventual triumph of riding solo, are crucial to building competence and resilience. Rossiter argues that overprotecting a child, shielding them from the natural consequences of their actions, can actually make it harder for them to develop that crucial sense of responsibility.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But doesn't this start to veer into the territory of parenting styles and how they might influence political views? I mean, is he suggesting that certain parenting styles are more likely to produce kids who lean liberal or conservative?
Yeah, it's important to remember. The Rossiter isn't advocating for any specific parenting style or the political stance. He's presenting a psychological framework for understanding how early experiences might shape our adult perspectives. It's about recognizing the potential long-term impacts of those early years, not about labeling one approach as right or wrong.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction. I can see how this could get misconstrued.
For sure.
So how does Rossiter explain the psychology behind what he calls modern liberalism while staying within this framework of understanding, not judging?
He makes a bold claim
Ah.
that modern liberalism, with its focus on government intervention and social safety nets, might stem from unresolved childhood needs for dependency. It's as if some individuals are seeking a parental figure, represented by the state, to provide security and fulfill needs that weren't fully met in childhood.
That's a thought-provoking idea. It's like those early experiences create a lens through which we view the role of government. So someone who experienced neglect or inconsistent care as a child might be more drawn to the idea of a strong, protective state that steps in to take care of its citizens.
That's the essence of his argument, yes. And he goes on to explore how this ties into what he calls the victim-villain-hero narrative that he sees as prevalent in modern liberal thinking. He argues that there's a tendency to frame social problems as the result of victims being exploited by villains, with the government cast as the hero who swoops in to save the day.
So instead of focusing on individual responsibility and agency, there's a tendency to look outside to systemic forces and those in power to explain societal problems. It sounds like he's suggesting there's a psychological comfort in seeing the world through that lens. But wouldn't that apply to certain conservative viewpoints as well? There are plenty of us versus them narratives on that side of the political spectrum, too.
Absolutely. It's important to note that Rossiter's not saying this is exclusive to one side of the political aisle. These are tendencies he's observing, not absolutes. His aim is to understand the potential psychological underpinnings of different worldviews, not to demonize any particular group.
That's crucial to keep in mind. This is all about understanding the deeper layers of how we form our beliefs, not about scoring points or reinforcing stereotypes. So if someone leans liberal and resonates with that victim, villain, hero narrative, what's the underlying psychological need he's suggesting is at play there?
Rossiter argues it could stem from a desire for security and protection, a longing for someone or something to shield us from the harsh realities of the world. It's like projecting those unmet childhood needs onto a larger societal stage, seeking a powerful entity, like the government, to step in and play the role of protector.
Okay, so we're starting to see how these seemingly disparate ideas, the bipolar nature of man, childhood development, and this victim, villain, hero narrative, all start to connect in Rossiter's framework. This is already giving me so much to think about. We've only just scratched the surface of his analysis, so stick with us as we continue to unpack the liberal mind in part 2 of our deep dive.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're continuing our exploration of the liberal mind by Lyle Rossiter, and we've been talking about how our early experiences can really shape our political views and how this ties into Rossiter's concept of the victim-villain-hero narrative.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is how Rossiter connects those individual psychological tendencies to the way societies function as a whole. He argues that a society's laws and institutions are essentially a reflection of its citizens' deeply held values and beliefs.
So if a society highly values individual liberty and self-reliance, its laws and institutions will reflect that.
Exactly.
And conversely, if a society leans more towards dependence on the state, you'd see that reflected in its systems and policies. Exactly. And this brings us back to the idea that our political beliefs aren't formed in a vacuum. They're shaped by our experiences, our values, our cultural context, and even, as Rossiter suggests, by our unconscious needs and fears.
That's a pretty powerful concept. You know, if our beliefs are so deeply rooted in our personal psychology, how can we even begin to have constructive conversations with people who hold different political views? It seems like we're all coming at it from these fundamentally different places.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? But I think Rossiter offers some valuable insights here. He stresses the importance of recognizing the inherent dignity and sovereignty of every individual, regardless of where they fall on the political spectrum.
So even if we vehemently disagree with someone's stance, we should still respect their right to hold that belief. It's about respecting the person, even if we challenge the idea itself.
Precisely. And that requires a willingness to truly listen, to try to understand where the other person is coming from, and to acknowledge that their perspective, even if we find it flawed, is likely rooted in their own unique life experiences. It's about having empathy, even when it's difficult.
Yeah, it's like that saying, everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Maybe we need to approach political discourse with a lot more empathy and understanding instead of just trying to score points or demonize the other side. But how do we even begin to bridge that gap when those underlying worldviews feel so fundamentally different?
Well, Rossiter challenges us to examine our own beliefs as well, to ask ourselves why we hold certain views, where those beliefs originated, and to be open to the possibility that we might be influenced by factors we're not even fully aware of.
That's a pretty humbling exercise, to admit that we might not be as rational and objective as we like to think we are. It reminds me of that quote by Anais Nin, "We don't see things as they are, we see them as we are."
Exactly. And that self-reflection is a crucial step toward having more honest and productive conversations about the kind of society we want to create. It's about building bridges instead of walls.
This makes me think about the role of government, a topic Rossiter delves into quite a bit. If we acknowledge that our individual psychology plays such a big role in shaping our political beliefs, how do we balance the need for individual freedom with the role of government in providing order and protecting its citizens? Is there a way to reconcile those sometimes competing needs?
Rossiter argues that the ideal role of government is to protect individual liberty, not to restrict it. He believes that a free society should allow its citizens to make their own choices, to pursue their own goals, and to cooperate voluntarily, without undue interference from the state.
That sounds great in theory, but isn't there a role for government in providing essential services like education and healthcare, or in regulating industries to protect consumers and the environment? Those all seem like legitimate functions of government.
There's definitely a healthy debate to be had about the scope of government involvement. Rossiter, being a libertarian, advocates for a very limited role for the state. He believes that most of these functions can be handled more effectively and efficiently by private individuals and organizations operating within a free market framework.
So he's essentially arguing against the welfare state model where the government takes on a more parental role in providing for its citizens.
That's right. He believes that excessive government intervention can lead to dependency, stifle innovation, and ultimately erode individual freedom. He sees a strong correlation between economic freedom and overall well-being, arguing that when people are free to pursue their own interests, it benefits society as a whole.
This brings up a key concept from the book, ordered liberty. Can you explain what Rossiter means by that? It sounds like a bit of a paradox.
Ordered liberty is the idea that individual freedom can actually flourish best within a framework of laws and institutions that protect basic rights and ensure a stable social order. It's about finding that sweet spot between anarchy and tyranny.
So it's not about absolute freedom to do whatever you want, but rather freedom within a system that respects the rights of all individuals, like having clear rules of the game that everyone agrees to play by.
Exactly. It's about establishing clear rules such as property rights, contract enforcement, and protection against violence
Yeah.
so that people can interact peacefully and productively. It's about creating a level playing field where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, while also ensuring that individual rights are protected.
That makes a lot of sense. But how does this idea of ordered liberty address issues like poverty, inequality, and discrimination? Those are complex problems that often require systemic solutions, not just individual effort.
Rossiter acknowledges the complexities of those issues, but he argues that the best long-term approach isn't through government redistribution of wealth, but by creating an environment where individuals have the opportunity to succeed through their own efforts. He believes in equality of opportunity, not necessarily equality of outcome.
So instead of focusing on ensuring everyone ends up in the same place, he's advocating for a system that gives everyone a fair chance to reach their full potential, regardless of their background or circumstances.
That's his core belief. He argues that government programs, while often well-intentioned, can sometimes create unintended consequences, like disincentivizing work or fostering resentment between different groups.
It sounds like he's making a case for personal responsibility and empowerment rather than relying on the state to solve all of society's problems. But isn't there a risk that this approach could leave some people behind, especially those who face significant systemic barriers?
That's a valid concern and one that Rossiter's critics often raise. They argue that his emphasis on individual responsibility can sometimes overshadow the very real systemic factors that contribute to poverty and inequality. They point to issues like racial discrimination, lack of access to quality education, and generational poverty as examples of barriers that individuals can't always overcome through sheer willpower and hard work.
So it's a complex issue with no easy answers. It seems like there's a tension between the libertarian ideal of individual freedom and the need to address systemic inequalities that can limit opportunity for certain groups.
Exactly. It's a balancing act, and there's no one-size-fits-all solution. But Rossiter's work encourages us to think deeply about these issues, to consider the potential unintended consequences of different policy approaches, and to be mindful of our own biases and assumptions as we engage in these debates.
This is all giving me a new perspective on the political landscape. While I may not agree with all of Rossiter's conclusions, I appreciate his thought-provoking analysis. This is one of those books that stays with you long after you finish reading it.
I agree. It raises important questions about how we can have more constructive political dialogue, how we can bridge the ideological divide, and how we can create a society that truly honors the principles of ordered liberty while also addressing issues of social justice. It's a conversation worth continuing.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, but we're not done yet. Join us for part 3, where we'll wrap up our exploration of the liberal mind and consider what it all means for us as individuals and as a society. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been exploring some really complex ideas from Lyle Rossiter's The Liberal Mind. It's been a journey through human nature and childhood development and the psychology that underpins our political beliefs. We've talked about how our early experiences, those deep-seated needs and drives, can actually influence how we view the world politically as adults.
It's been fascinating to unpack Rossiter's perspective, especially his analysis of the victim-villain-hero narrative and how it might manifest in liberal thinking. He sees this tendency to frame social problems through that lens where certain groups are seen as victims, others as villains, and the government is often cast as the hero who steps in to right the wrongs.
And he connects this back to the psychological need for security and protection, which might stem from those early childhood experiences we talked about. It's like we're projecting those unmet needs onto a larger societal stage, seeking a powerful entity to play the role of protector. But earlier, we also touched on how this kind of us versus them thinking isn't exclusive to one side of the political spectrum. So how does Rossiter explain the appeal of this narrative, particularly within the context of modern liberalism?
Rossiter suggests it might tap into a deep-seated desire for a sense of belonging and moral clarity. Identifying with a group that sees itself as righteous and fighting for a just cause can be psychologically appealing. It provides a sense of purpose and solidarity.
So it's about more than just policy positions. It's about aligning with a worldview that feels morally right and emotionally satisfying. It's like finding your tribe, so to speak, and feeling a sense of purpose in fighting for a common cause.
Exactly, and Rossiter argues that for some, this can lead to a tendency to simplify complex issues, to see things in black and white terms, and to demonize those who hold opposing views.
That makes sense. When we feel strongly about something, it's easy to fall into that trap of us versus them, thinking it takes a lot of effort to step back and see the nuances, the gray areas, and to acknowledge the humanity of those we disagree with. But this whole discussion about the role of government, that's where things get really interesting. Rossiter, being a libertarian, obviously advocates for a very limited role for the state, but how does he reconcile that with the very real needs that exist in society? The need for social safety nets, for regulations to protect consumers and the environment, those all seem like legitimate functions of government.
Those are crucial questions, and Rossiter doesn't shy away from them. He acknowledges that there will always be people who need assistance, but he believes that a free market combined with voluntary cooperation and private charity is a more effective and ethical way to address those needs than relying on large-scale government programs.
So he's essentially advocating for a shift in responsibility from the state to the individual and the community. He believes that people are more likely to thrive when they're empowered to solve problems themselves rather than relying on the government to step in.
That's the core of his argument. He sees a direct link between individual initiative, economic freedom, and societal progress, and he cautions against creating systems that foster dependency and discourage self-reliance.
But how does he address concerns about those who are truly disadvantaged? Those who might not be able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, so to speak. I mean, there are systemic barriers that can make it incredibly difficult for some people to succeed, regardless of how hard they work.
Rossiter acknowledges those systemic issues, but he believes that the best long-term solution is to create an environment where everyone has equal opportunity to succeed, rather than focusing on trying to engineer equal outcomes through government intervention.
So instead of redistributing wealth or implementing large-scale social programs, he's advocating for policies that create a more level playing field, that remove barriers to opportunity and empower individuals to take control of their own lives. It sounds like he's placing a lot of faith in the power of individual initiative and the free market to solve social problems.
He is, and that's where his critics often push back.
Oh.
They argue that his emphasis on individual responsibility can sometimes overshadow the very real systemic factors that contribute to poverty and inequality. They point to issues like racial discrimination, lack of access to quality education, and generational poverty as examples of barriers that individuals can't always overcome through sheer willpower and hard work.
It sounds like we're back to that balancing act we talked about earlier, trying to find that sweet spot between individual freedom and collective responsibility, between empowering individuals and addressing systemic issues. There are no easy answers here.
Exactly.
It's a complex web of interconnected issues, and there's no one-size-fits-all solution. But Rossiter's work encourages us to think deeply about these things, to consider the potential unintended consequences of different policy approaches, and to be mindful of our own biases and assumptions as we engage in these debates.
I think that's a really valuable takeaway from this whole discussion. It's easy to get caught up in the rhetoric, the emotional arguments, and the us versus them mentality that so often dominates political discourse. But Rossiter's analysis challenges us to go deeper, to examine the psychological and social underpinnings of our beliefs, and to approach these complex issues with more nuanced empathy and a willingness to understand perspectives that differ from our own.
I couldn't agree more. It's about having those difficult conversations, not to win arguments or score points, but to truly understand each other and to work together to create a more just and equitable society. This deep dive into the liberal mind has been incredibly thought-provoking. It's challenged me to think more critically about my own beliefs, to be more aware of the influences that have shaped my worldview, and to approach political discourse with more humility and open-mindedness. And I hope it's done the same for our listeners. So as we wrap up this episode, I want to leave you with a final thought. If, as Rossiter suggests, our political beliefs are so deeply intertwined with our personal experiences and psychological needs, can we ever truly separate those influences and engage in rational, objective discourse about the best way to organize society? It's a challenging question, but one that I believe is worth pondering as we continue to navigate the complex world of politics. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep those minds open, keep those conversations going, and we'll see you next time.